Back in 1961, at the height of the Cold War, a British lawyer and human rights activist named Peter Benenson wrote an article calling on activists all over the world to organize against repressive governments and advocate for human rights across the divide of a world that was then divided between the Soviet sphere and the American sphere. That piece, titled The Forgotten Prisoners, essentially marks the creation of Amnesty International. Today, Amnesty is the world's largest, most storied human rights organization, more than 7 million people involved. They publish reports systematically documenting injustices and abuses all over the world. In places like Iran, where they've highlighted the execution crisis, and in Russia, Putin's Russia, the crackdown on dissent there, and Syrian detention and torture under Bashar al-Assad. Now they are out with a new report on Israel, specifically its war in Gaza. The report, titled "You Feel Like You Are Subhuman: Israel's Genocide Against Palestinians in Gaza," documents Israel's actions during its ongoing offensive in Gaza following the Hamas attacks on October 7, 2023. In it, Amnesty examines the killings of civilians, damage to and destruction of civilian infrastructure, the obstruction of humanitarian aid, concluding that, quote, Israel has committed genocide against Palestinians in Gaza. The Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs has responded, calling it, quote, a fabricated report that is entirely false and based on lies. Joining me now is Paul O'Brien. He's the executive director of Amnesty International USA. It's good to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
First, just take me through the nature of the report, its methodology, and its sort of top-line finding.
It's a comprehensive report. It's nearly 300 pages. It took us many, many months to put together. And its ultimate finding is looking at the law on genocide, the International Convention, which came into effect in 1948. Israel signed it in 1950. The United States signed it in the 80s. It lays out what the law on genocide is and how the thresholds are met. So we looked at those thresholds. We looked in depth at what was going on the ground in Gaza over many months. We did hundreds of interviews, more than 200. We looked at 100 different statements of Israeli officials. We did field research, which was very dangerous at times, on the ground. We looked at digital and video evidence, and we drew that conclusion. The key part of the Genocide Convention is that two things must be in place. The population, a protected population, must be destroyed in whole or in part, and there must be specific intent to do so.
I want to speak about that intent question. But first, I want to sort of ask about other places where we have seen enormous civilian casualties. In Mosul, for instance, in the anti-ISIS campaign, in which you had a very sort of trapped civilian population, and you had men, women, and children dying left and right under Allied, bombing and airstrikes. In Assad's war against the Syrian people, and this is Syrian civil war, in Chechnya under Putin. These are all places where we've seen enormous human tolls, but have not been characterized as genocide. What marks this as different?
The standard on genocide legally is very high. The evidentiary threshold to prove it very high, and all the more so in warfare, where militaries will have multiple goals. One of the misconceptions is that you can't have a genocide if you have a military goal, for example, to defeat Hamas. Genocide can happen during a conflict if the actions, the statements, and the context demonstrate that those with power to do so intend the destruction of the population. So, yes, it's found very rarely, but we found that all of those conditions are in place in Gaza.
This question of intent,
yep.
Essentially the mens rea here in the crime of genocide.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people who think that word is wrong, but who are also similarly anguished about the scale of destruction in Gaza, which I don't think is really debatable. It's clearly the enormous amounts of both human and physical destruction, right? Would say that those are accidents, those are not intentional. There is a lot of writing in this report about intent.
Right.
How do your investigators come to those conclusions about intent?
Right. Well, three different areas of investigation. One, the offence on the ground as we examine them. Secondly, the context that it began with. And thirdly, the direct statements of the officials. So just on that first one, and let me just take you back to the law. The law has three areas in which we are supposed to examine under the Genocide Convention. One is the killings, the nature of the killings and the scale of the killings. Second, wounding and mental harm. And thirdly, the destruction of conditions of life. If any of those are done in such a way as to destroy a population, then the genocide threshold is met. We looked at facts on the ground like the following. The way that bombings happened, large area bombs placed at night, killing multiple generations of Palestinians, children, infants, parents, grandparents. We looked at attacks on the infrastructure that would allow life to continue, farms, schools, hospitals, clinics. And what we saw was they were being attacked repeatedly, and we saw that they were being attacked after the IDF had taken control over them. There were no longer military threats, and they were being destroyed again. We looked at the nature of forced displacements, which were not, from our understanding, could not be justified for solely military purposes. People being moved again and again and again, and once they'd been moved, attacked where they'd been moved. Some people being moved up to 10 times. We looked at specific intentional acts that the Israeli military did, torturing, arbitrary detention, the way that they dehumanized the people that they were arresting, often without basis. And it wasn't one or two incidences. It was a constant pattern of these incidences. The same with aid, a pattern of using aid. And remember, this was a very fragile population to start with. And they were not allowing them to access the aid they needed simply to survive.
The Israeli military and COGAT, which is the organization that oversees aid into Gaza, basically says these are lies. We've allowed all the aid in. That the problem with aid is on the NGOs. Of course, the NGOs say that they're stopping us. I don't want to say that that's the final word, but that's their contention. You write in the report, the investigators write in the report, Israel's deliberate obstruction of humanitarian movement within Gaza and its failure to put in place security guarantees, ensure humanitarian workers would be protected from attacks by Israeli forces, further restricted humanitarian aid from reaching civilians. You also say that it carried out Israel unlawful attacks during the 9-month period under review that deliberately killed and injured many civilians, in many cases likely amount to war crimes. The 15 airstrikes whose investigation documentation Amnesty International has presented above constitute direct attacks on civilians and civilian objects or indiscriminate attacks. Can you say that categorically based on the evidence, given the nature of Hamas, given the nature that obviously Hamas fighters are in many cases not going to announce themselves? They're not going to necessarily, take up a base or a position where it's known that they're there.
Yeah. Well, first, let's just be clear that what Hamas did on October 7, 2023 were war crimes. We've documented them as war crimes. We'll be following up with future investigations of all of the natures of their violations of international law. The way that they are prosecuting the war does not, under the Genocide Convention, give the Israeli army permission to kill off a population. What we looked at, we did look at these defenses that are made, military necessity and so on, and under our examination of the facts on the ground, there is no justification for the manner in which the Israeli military are targeting civilians at scale.
Paul O'Brien, who is the executive director of Amnesty International, I really appreciate you taking time to talk to us tonight. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.